It was one of those warm, fresh, late spring days on Australia's east coast, and the irony, considering all that was to follow, is that Allan Wells headed into the race feeling close to unbeatable. Few who have never forgotten the Commonwealth Games 200 meters final of October 1982 knew that the 30-year-old had been to hell and back in the weeks leading up it. The 1980 Olympic 100 meters champion had traveled to Brisbane via the Nike Athletics base at Eugene, Oregon, where they had wanted him, the white guy, to take on the black American sprinters. In this, of all places, you would not expect the blocks to half cripple an athlete. Yet they did. They had spikes, set into the track, Wells recalls, but in my first full-out start, they slipped. My right leg strained at the back of the knee. And so it was that Wells landed in Australia, 10 days before the games, unsure whether, as he confided at the time to wife Margot, he was going to have a good Commonwealth Games or a good holiday. Twice daily treatment sessions and a lot of deep heat ointment were part of his fight to be fit. I couldn't train, so I decided to go full out in the first round of the 100 meters, he says. Other athletes were asking, "Why are you running so fast?" But the speed was not in my legs. The heats were my only way of finding it. The young East London athlete destined to push him stride for stride to the finish line in the game's most iconic and defining race was, with the greatest respect, not on Wells' mind at all. Mike McFarlane certainly had promise. As an 18-year-old at the 1978 Commonwealths in Edmonton, he had finished fifth in the 200 meters final won by Wells. Both had been in Britain's 4x100m team, who finished fourth at the Moscow Olympics in 1980, but what lay between them did not extend much beyond respect. In 1982, I was a kid, McFarlane says. We were from very different backgrounds. Me, Hackney, him, Scotland. And there was the age gap. McFarlane's parents were Caribbean immigrants and the sprinter he admired was Jamaican Don Quarry, Olympic 200 meters gold medalist in 1976. McFarlane's tribulations before Brisbane had not been dissimilar to those of Wells. He had been injured, a hamstring, midway through the season and missed the European Championships. But there can be a sense of freedom when you come from nowhere. Pressure is what you make it. If you put too much on yourself, you never perform, McFarlane says. Make the final and see what happens. That's how I viewed it. The numbers provided a clue that little might divide the two in the 200 meters final. Wells took gold in the Brisbane 100 meters to 0.09 seconds faster than 22-year-old McFarlane, who finished fifth, and the second 200 meters semifinal was even tighter. Just 0.07 seconds separated the pair. McFarlane felt he was running well. Missing half the season can make you fresh, he says. Wells also began to feel he had shaken off that dull ache behind his knee and found his best level as the 200 meters competition gathered pace. I felt so good in the 200 meters semi-final, $1 million, he says. The pain had gone. There was no need to run my pants off to reach that final. No disrespect to Michael when I say I sensed I would be 3 yards faster in the final. I was confident. The Queen was in the stadium when the two Britons stepped out for the final. There was a slight headwind, but it was not far off perfect sprinting conditions. Wells and McFarlane both think they probably shook hands. Only when the starting pistol fired did something tell Wells that all was not as it should be. He had eaten something the night before that didn't go down well, he says. Something wasn't quite right. That first pistol presaged a false start, but the few strides before the athletes were brought back made the Scot uneasy. My legs felt heavy. I thought, oh Christ. He certainly showed no such effects after the gun sounded a second time. Wells, in lane 5, flew out of the blocks in the K Stadium, the BBC commentator David Coleman remarked. With all eyes on the blue-shirted standout favourite, the white-vested McFarlane, 3 lanes inside, is overlooked in commentary. But all that changes as the 9 athletes emerge from the bend. One of my strengths was always that I could run the curve. Get the hell out of the curve and see how it looks. That's how I approached it, McFarlane says. It certainly looked good that day. As they hit the straight, McFarlane leads and Coleman feels that Wells has been jolted by the sheer power of McFarlane. Wells has the fight of his life, while McFarlane is running the race of his life, says the commentator. Wells ties up slightly, I think, with the shock of the threat on his inside. Wells insists McFarlane was not the problem. I don't see him, he says. I just sense how bad I suddenly feel. Here I am, in the final, and I'm tired. I'm feeling like a tractor. 5 seconds out, McFarlane still leads and doesn't yet see Wells. I'm thinking, I'm going to get a medal here, he says. Wells glances left and says it is only now that he sees the Englishman. He looks for something to rescue a desperate situation. I know I have to put in a last effort. He draws level with McFarlane, who now clocks the Scot. I see him out of the corner of my eye, McFarlane says. I'm thinking, if he's going to win it, I'm going to get a medal. That lifts me. I punch a little bit harder. Wells' effort is palpable, his head and chest moving as he strains for the finish. McFarlane is far smoother, he looks to be cruising. The finish is impossible to call with the naked eye. Both clocked 20.43 seconds, thousandths of a second, were not used in 1982. Yet in the immediate aftermath, Wells hears McFarlane's delighted screams. "I heard him saying something, repeating something." He was obviously pleased with what he had achieved. They shook hands, though little was said. "There wasn't much conversation between us then. I do remember that," McFarlane recalls. The footage captures Wells' disappointment. He shakes his head. While McFarlane, out of camera shot, hangs around at the track, Wells wanders into a trackside tent. It was 12 foot square, with a seat in one corner, a telephone and table, and nobody in it, he remembers. It was somewhere to go and disappear, really. Wells had been in there for perhaps 10 minutes and was in his tracksuit when the phone suddenly rang. "I thought, who the hell is that?" Wells says. "So I picked it up. It was the photo finish man, with a decision to impart that was, and remains, unprecedented in any major championships. The result was a dead heat." He said. "I can't split you," Wells relates, "but do you want to come and look at the picture?" The judge, it transpired, was at the back of the stand, which would have involved a trek through the ranks of the watching public. "I said no," Wells says. "I was tired, but I had to question in my own mind why they were asking me up. Were they unsure?" McFarlane was offered no such opportunity, though that did not bother the young Haringey Club sprinter. It was only years later that he would regret that the time spent deliberating meant he had no lap of honor. Suddenly, he found himself sharing the top step of a winner's podium with Wells. "We shook hands again and I think I made a joke of it," he says. "I don't think Allan did. He was more serious." "Yes," says Wells. "I think Michael went up first and made it look like he'd won the thing," he recalls. "He wasn't going to move over for me." The outcome also entailed half of each national anthem being played, though that was in keeping with the way it had gone for Wells that the Scots anthem graded. It was Scotland the Brave, not Flower of Scotland back then, and they played it at a hell of a speed. It was hard to be inspired by that. It was to be a last major international gold for Wells, who is a part-time systems engineer at the University of Surrey and continues to work with Scottish athletics. And it was a competitive career high for McFarlane, though the Englishman also went on to be a successful coach with Dwayne Chambers, Tony Jarrett and John Regis. "It was a strange feeling standing on the top step with Allan," reflects 57-year-old McFarlane. "They call the Commonwealths the friendly games, but they were fierce." Wow. Yes. The race that day was fierce.